Morning everyone, it's really great to be with you all. I think who I am is more important than my long list of job titles. And I grew up in a part of Newcastle called Cowgate, for any of you who are familiar with it. And I went to a school that was called Blakelaw School. I've got a picture of it. And it was famously named and shamed as the worst school in Britain, not by me, I should add, but by the Sun newspaper. And it was one of David Blunkett's list of failing schools, and it was the first school in the country to be fresh started and eventually closed down. But it was an interesting time, and it looks just like how I remember going to school. Because it wasn't, if I had a very positive experience of school there, of the staff there, but it was about the catchment area that we grew up in and the poverty that we were living in that produced the outcomes that were very few of us. I think 6% or something like that children left the school with any GCSE of any grade, let alone an A to C grade. And it wasn't because we were stupid or because the school was failing, but it was because we were growing up in poverty. And I guess it's that experience of being a child in poverty myself, which has led to a whole lifetime of trying to tackle and eradicate child poverty, which kind of brings me here today to share some of those stories with you. So it's very important to me. My mum and dad still live in the same council house on the same estate next to the school, and my family are very much still living with the consequences of growing up in an area with entrenched poverty. But I think, and you know, despite trying to do something about it for decades, I think in recent years I felt like not only are we not ending poverty, but things are getting worse. And most of the children and the families that I've been working with in my career, all of them have parents who are working at earning jobs, and none of them can afford to eat 3 meals a day. And poverty when I was a kid was not like that at all. So I think there's something fundamentally shifting and changing, but that does give me hope, because I wouldn't be standing here today if I didn't think we could eradicate poverty. If anyone remembers, we had that target, didn't we, to eradicate poverty by 2020, yet here we are in 2024, we couldn't be further from that. These are photographs that were taken by some of the young people that I worked with. We just give them all cameras and asked them to document what their lives look like. We didn't say to document poverty, but it was just to give a bit of a snapshot and a flavour, to hold these images in our minds as we talk about this, because this is real people's lives that we're talking about. Empty fridges, playing in backyards, these are housing circumstances, so multiple children sleeping on floors in overcrowded housing, and people go on about, well, there's no poverty today, everyone has a big television and a mobile phone, and this photograph really struck me of that not all families have really big televisions and mobile phones. There's still a lot of kids out there where this is what they have. So where are we today in terms of poverty? I think it's really important to throw some statistics at you, because my sense of talking with families and children is that things are getting worse, but this is borne out by the data. Now, this is the latest official data on poverty statistics for the UK. You'll see that it says 2022 to 2023 because there's always a lag in the data being gathered. And this is the most recently published household below average income figures. And that shows us that 4.3 million children are living in poverty. Now, this is up from 3.6 million a decade ago, and it equates to about 30% of children, or if it helps you to visualise it, 9 children in every classroom of 30 children that will be experiencing poverty. I think it's really interesting to note some of the more detailed data that sits beneath that. 46% of children, think about that for a minute, that's nearly half of all children who are in a house with 3 or more children are grown up in poverty. Now that's up from 36%, and that's really important when we come back to think about the policies and the actions that we can take to eradicate it. 44%, again almost half of all children in lone-parent households are living below the poverty line. This one terrifies me. 36% of children in a family with a child under the age of 5 grown up in poverty. And we just need to think about childcare costs and what having a young child does to household finances. I say that with a 4-year-old child. That it puts enormous strain on families having young children. And we know that if you're born poor and you're a poor child, your chances of being a poor adult are really high. There's pretty much no social mobility anymore. So this isn't just things that are going to affect a child's life, but are going to continue to affect them throughout the rest of their lives. And then this last one for me is the real key to the conversation that we're having today. 70% of children living in poverty across the country are from working households. Their parents are in job. And then often it's not just one parent, but two parents that are going out to work every day, but they're not able to bring enough money into the household to lift their children out of poverty.
Excuse me, can I just ask where they came from, the NJPN?
This is the official data, so there's the household below average income data, the government data, and I can share links to the full reports if people are interested. A little bit more recent data that we have is from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, who produced this in June of this year. And again, some really interesting statistics that help us find a way out of this mess. 2/3 of all parliamentary constituencies have a child poverty rate of 25% or more. And in areas such as the North East, the North West, West Midlands and Wales, they're very high, it will almost always be over 25%.
Yeah.
For me in the North East, 89% of all constituencies have at least 1 in 4 children born under poverty. And this last one, with GRF data, I think is really important for us to think about. There is an extremely high correlation right across the country, not just in areas of high rates of poverty, but right across the country, between high levels of poverty and a high proportion of children affected by what we call the two-child limit policy. So again, this is pointing us into the direction where we need to go if we want to do something about these shocking statistics. Now, how do we do something about it? If 70% of children living in poverty have working parents, we have to begin to ask the question, why is it that people are going to work and are not able to afford to live a decent life? And if you look at the problem of low pay, we begin to flesh out this picture a little bit. 1 in 8 people earning below the real living wage. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what the difference is between the real living wage, the government minimum wage. And again, low pay is a gendered issue because more women are working in low paid jobs, in certain sector economy jobs, and they're of course more likely to be raising children. It's also an issue of race, where you've got 50% of racialised workforce earning below the living wage compared to 30% of white workers. And despite the steps that have been taken to try and ease things like inflation, food banks are still reporting that almost half of all the people that come to them are people coming who are working and not earning enough to live on. And we have to think about what's happened over the last few years, don't we? We have experienced the worst cost of living crisis, certainly in my lifetime. Inflation has been at its highest for 30 years. All of us will have seen an impact in our energy, travel, mortgages and rent costs. Electricity increased by 66% and gas by 129% in the 12 months to March 2023. A lot of you would have been involved in establishing things like warm hubs to try and deal with the consequences of that. Food inflation is almost at 20%, which is the highest official figures for 45 years. And that's just for household essentials. If you begin to look at things like cooking oil or baby formula, that rises even higher to 25%. And people will have seen the devastating news stories of people buying formula milk and watering it down with water to make it last longer in order to feed their children. And we know that inflation in rent and mortgages is spread out because as people's fixed-term contracts have come to an end, that's hit people at different times. So there are still a whole raft of people coming out with fixed-term contracts that's beginning to hit this year. But during that same time, wages have stagnated. So there's been a rapid decline in household living standards. Pay has risen at a far lower rate at 6%. So they estimated that that is what led to more than 1 million people being plunged into poverty, with families struggling to afford the basics to survive. And if you look at things like food banks, again, a lot of you will have been involved in food banks as a way to try and tackle the consequences of some of this. The Trussell Trust reported that in the 12 months from April 2023 to March 2024, They gave out 3.1 million emergency food parcels in that time. And that was the highest number of food parcels they gave out in any single year, even higher than the peak during the COVID pandemic. And it was a 94% increase in the period in the 5 years before that. 760,000 were people using the food bank for the first time. So we know that despite inflation easing and things changing in the economy, the reality on the ground is that this is still being very sharply felt by people experiencing poverty. And in the northeast, where I am, it was a 54% increase in the number of food parcels being distributed in the previous year. So we're seeing deepening hardship, deepening distress, and more people going without the basic essentials like food. I would argue that food is a fundamental human right. And we know that the poorest households spend a greater percentage of their household income on things like food, so that it's affecting the poorest worse, so it's deepening and entrenching poverty that already existed. But does it matter? We were told, weren't we, a little while ago that maybe we just need to accept that we're getting poorer. The governor of the Bank of England famously said that recently, didn't he, that we're just going to have to get used to it. And I would hope that none of us would accept that, and I want to tell you a bit about why I don't accept that. Where I live in the northeast, Father Chris would have been with me today, we usually go as a duo, but he couldn't make it today. But where he is based in the Meadowell, you can walk from the Meadowell into Tynemouth, which has just been given, Tynemouth Church, in his little patch, and life expectancy can decline by 15 years. And now I think that's unacceptable. That an accident at birth can take 15 years out of your life. I don't think any of us should be accepting that. If you look at the health inequalities, the infant mortality rates, chronic health conditions like asthma, I have asthma, unsurprisingly, I'm 5'2", it literally shrinks us, the impact of poverty. And for the first time ever, children's heights are beginning to decline again. For the first time ever, average life expectancy is beginning to decline again. So we can't underestimate the impact that poverty has on our lives, and we should not be accepting that that is the way to go on. As a parent of 2 children, I will fight till the end of my days to make sure that this injustice and inequality doesn't continue. But we also have this issue of not just low-paid work, but insecure work. We have a lot of horrendous tables in the northeast, and the other one is that we are the 0 hours capital of the country. So we have more people on 0-hour contracts than anywhere else. So not just are people in low-paid jobs, but they don't know how many hours they're going to have. If you have a job that's contracted 2 or 3 hours a week, how on earth do you manage your household finances? You can't claim benefits in the same way because you're not unemployed. You have a job, you just don't know how many hours you're going to be working. So at the minute, we've got 3.4 million workers in the UK in insecure work, and again, that affects all those different groups disproportionately. We know that this is endemic in the social care sector, for example. A lot of care workers, they get shifts cancelled at the last moment and so on. So I'm not presenting this to you that the real living wage is a solution to all of the problems in the UK. There are other issues that we need to look at too, and I think insecure employment is one of them. I'm really excited that the government has got the Employment Rights Bill there at the minute, which is looking to try and address some of this issue of insecurity. And there was a consultation, and I would urge everyone to contribute to that consultation, because at the minute there's no definition of what low hours is, and we have to have some kind of unacceptable law about that. So there's an opportunity for us to be shaping that policy right at the minute. And these are just some quotes from the Northeast recently, from someone who was running a baby bank, but also from a Northeast mum. I won't keep them out of reading themselves. But just to bring it alive, like this is people's lives. I can throw lots of statistics at you, but we can become a bit numb to the statistics and how horrendous they are. But what does that actually mean for people's day-to-day life? When you're living, you're working, you're trying to raise a family, but you can't afford basics. So Citizens Advice Bureau is part of our Alliance of Timely Citizens, and the advice workers there keep saying to me, like, we can't give people advice because their income just can never match that outcome, and there's nothing luxurious that they're spending money on housing costs, their utility bills and their food. And we know that when people are faced with that, the first thing that goes is food. Because you can't cut on your housing costs because you get evicted. You can't cut on your energy bills because they get turned off. So you cut back on food. In most families, it'll be the mum that will go without food the most, because they'll do the best they can to make sure that the kids are fed. And this is why we see this explosion in food bank usage and so on. So how do we respond? Like, that's the bad news. I'm sure you all want a bit of good news after all of that. The thing about poverty is, and that we know this, is it is incredibly policy responsive. The things that we can do can have a dramatic impact to reverse the levels of poverty that we have. So we have a huge opportunity to do something about it. And I think it's easy to feel overwhelmed by the scale of the problem that you just don't do anything. Or what I think we tend to do, and what we have a tendency to do, is to have a crisis response to it. So we'll collect for a food bank, we'll set up a warm hub, we'll do a baby bank. Now that is not tackling the problem, that is just sticking a bit of plaster over the crack of the problem. And I understand why people do it, and I'm not saying it's a bad thing. If people are hungry, you should feed them. But it's becoming so mainstream now, a food bank, isn't it? That it's not even challenged. Like, I think it's disgusting that we have a food bank. It's humiliating and degrading to have to use one. And if 70% of people in poverty are at work, shouldn't we be looking at something else more structural that we could be doing that would make a difference? And I think that's what we want to talk a bit more about here today. And I just want to share a couple of stories of where I've seen this happen and the biggest impact of it all. And we're going to go way back in history now to where the living wage movement came from. And this is a photograph from Telco, which is our colleagues in East London, part of Citizens. And this is a meeting in Bethnal Green when the campaign began. And it didn't begin with a conversation about poverty. It didn't begin with a conversation about the level of wages. It actually began with a conversation about, I want to spend more time with my family and loved ones. And why would people not spend more time with their family and loved ones? Because they had 3 or 2 jobs. And why did they have 3 or 2 jobs? Because they weren't earning enough to live on the salary of 1 job. So the focus for the campaign became, well, what if employers paid a real living wage based on the cost of living and nothing else? Then maybe we would do 1 or 2 jobs and we'd have more time to spend with our families. So a lot of the people gathered, a lot of the churches convened, and they had these conversations through their church groups. We're working as cleaners in the financial part of Canary Wharf in East London. So the target became, because you're constantly drilling down when you're trying to campaign, and you're trying to work out where do you start, where do you go. We're working for HSBC Bank. Let's ask HSBC Bank if they would pay cleaners a living wage. You always ask first. So they wrote a letter to HSBC Bank and Sir John Bond, who was in charge at the time. They got no reply. My mum was a cleaner. If you're a cleaner and you write a letter, not many people take notice of you. So instead they took a £1 share in HSBC Bank, which meant they were then shareholders of the bank and could attend the formal meeting where all the senior decision makers of the bank would be gathered. And they attended en masse the shareholders meeting at HSBC Bank, and a priest who lives in the northeast now, Simon Mason, a lot of you might know, he's an Anglican priest. He was working in East London at the time, and he called the meeting to order. It's very useful to have priests on your side, because if I hadn't called the meeting to order, I would have probably been thrown out. But Reverend Dr. Simon was taken seriously. And he said he had an urgent item to put on the agenda. That was fine, yes. He said, I've got your cleaner here. He wants to speak to you. So Abdul Durant had the floor, and he asked Sir John Bond, you know, I clean your office, do I do a good job? And he said, of course you do. He said, so why don't you pay me enough to live on? And that was the start of the living wage movement. They didn't get them to pay the wages then, but over time they did. It was actually Barclays did it before HSBC, but they did begin to get that movement, and that's where it starts, and that's the tradition in which it sits, that we have tried to continue in the North East. Unsurprisingly, it's always been a big campaign in our region, but nationally, it has put over £3 billion living wage week just a couple of weeks ago, and the rates were increased, which will mean 500,000 workers are getting a pay rise, and there are now 15,000 employers across the country who voluntarily pay it. These are the new rates. It's calculated independently by the Resolution Foundation based on a basket of goods. So depending on what's happening in the world and how much food and things cost, that affects the rate of pay, and everyone who's accredited have to uplift their pay as things get more expensive. But it's also based on things like having a children's birthday party and essential things like that are important to feel a part of your community and society and having a good life. It's good for business. I'll send you these links. I'm less interested in this side of it, but it is a business interest to do it. It does help with recruitment and retention, and they save money as a business in the long run. So in the North East, when we started this campaign, unsurprisingly as an alliance, poverty has always been on our agenda to do something about because it affects us disproportionately, I think, in the North East. And I just wanted to share a couple of stories that I think will hopefully give you some ideas about what you all might want to do with it. One was that the Catholic diocese was at the heart of spearheading it. And you don't often hear that, right? I always say to Father Chris, you are rubbish. It's like celebrating and shouting about the things that you really good at. And the Catholic diocese led the way and said, we can't tackle poverty if we don't do it ourselves. So as a first action, we will become a living wage employer. And if you visit the Hexham Newcastle offices, this is a picture at the back on their wall, which meant that the bishop and others could speak publicly about it and call on others in our region to do the same thing. At that point, we had only 30 accredited living wage employers in our region, not a surprise. And we had this dream, we had a meeting, a lot of church leaders, a lot of faith leaders at the start, and we said we had an ambition. We wanted to get a local authority, because none of them were paying it. We wanted to get a university, because none of them were paying it. We wanted to get a football club, because they certainly weren't paying it. And we wanted to build momentum in a movement that everyone in the North East would want to pay a living wage. Because we felt like we can't wait for elections, we can't wait for politicians to do the right thing. This is something we can do as people in the North East to try and address this horrendous situation that we find ourselves in, and we're not relying on anyone else to do it, we're just going to crack on and do it. So that was what we did. We sent out a lot of letters. None of them, I will warn you, one of them actually replied and said, oh yeah, that's a good idea. And it was the Virgin Money Foundation, but nobody else replied. Only it was that easy. But it's an important first step. You should give people a bit of a warning that you're coming. And then we strategically chose who were the employers we were going to go after first. And the first one was actually Newcastle University, because we felt it was an anchor institution in the heart of our city that employed a lot of people, and that was where we would start. And the university said, no thanks, we don't want to do that, our staff are dead happy, they're really happy, they have great terms and conditions. So we always say no, and they always say why. So we said, oh, that's really interesting, could we speak to some staff? Like, you do what you want. So that's what we did. So we started talking to people in the canteen, catering staff, cleaning staff, porter and security staff. And at the end of it, we had about 250 staff from those jobs who were like, we really would love a living wage, but it's never going to happen. I've worked here, a lot of them had worked there for a long time, but it's not going to happen. But yeah, we should pay because I can't afford the bus fare to get to university, to get to work, have to walk. I've never been on holiday for 15 years. I would love to be able to buy my kids a computer so that they do their homework. And we began to get all these stories that we were capturing and feeding back to the university, who prided itself on being a civic institution, who at the time was saying, we give Martin Luther King an honorary doctorate 3 weeks before he was assassinated. And they built this statue very helpfully in the centre of Newcastle University. It had the words war, poverty and racism around the bottom. We said, interesting that you're perpetuating the evils that you discussed. And this is what your staff are saying, and we're like, oh gosh, maybe we do need to do something about it. So they said, well, we'll pay it, but we won't accredit. We were like, that sounds a bit strange. Why would you not accredit it? We knew it was because it meant their contracted staff, which is often the low-paid staff, right? To become a living wage accredited employer, you have to get your contracts in order too. It's not just your directly employed staff. And we know that low-paid workers often get contracted out. It's the cleaning staff, it's the catering staff. So that was the problem. So the catering staff said, well, the board meets on this day. Guess who serves them their coffees? Me. Wouldn't it be fun if we all wrote a little note on a napkin and served it with their cup of tea? So when they're in a meeting discussing whether they're going to pay their staff, they're confronted with the reality. So that's what they did, and lo and behold, they voted to become a real living wage employer. This is a picture from Sunderland University, which I always think is worth getting out at this time of year. We did the same thing there. We said to Sunderland, well, Newcastle have done it, why can't you do it? We play on the rivalry a lot. And they were like, well, we're not Newcastle, we don't have the money that Newcastle has, Sunderland, we're a bit poorer. And we don't want to pay, our staff are happy, same pattern beginning to emerge. We said, oh great, let's speak to some of the staff. So again, we spoke to the staff, they were like, no, this is impacting on our life. And we said, will you discuss it as a board? No, the agenda's a bit busy. So this is us outside of the board meeting at Sunderland University. And it was nearly Christmas, so we took Santa, you can see Santa there, who put Sunderland University on the naughty list for paying poverty wages. And everyone was dressed as elves, and we rewrote Christmas carols, jingle bells, about the living wage. And they came out and we gave them a gift of mince pies, and there's the red piece of paper there had all the codes from the cleaning staff, and we asked them to take it into their meeting. So then they said, okay, we will meet with you, we've got a meeting with the Pro Vice-Chancellor, but you've only got 20 minutes. So we were like, what can we do in 20 minutes that will convince them to do it? So we just took the cleaner with us, and the cleaner had the floor, and she just told them, this is the reality of my life, on low pay, and this is, I'm proud to work in Sunderland, I live in Sunderland, but this is the reality of the wages of my life. And they voted to become a living wage employer. Last week we celebrated Durham University and Northumbria University have joined them, so we've got a full suite of universities. We did a campaign at Newcastle Council, which was a very hard fight, where they did say on stage to us, we haven't got the magic money tree, which point I did almost throw something at the deputy leader of the council, but I didn't. But they now are a living wage employer, Sunderland Council is a living wage employer, and they've launched to become living wage cities, which means the council chair and run a forum of employers to say how we're going to get more people over the line. And I couldn't not mention the football club. Mike Ashley ran the football club when we started the campaign, and he really didn't care less. I mean, there were stories at the time, you might remember, of people giving birth in toilets. He didn't, we couldn't use the press or appeal to his better nature, he didn't have one. But when he sold the club, which was a controversial move in the city, we knew that was a golden opportunity. And he sold the club, if you're not a football fan, you probably won't know this, but to the Saudi royal family or something, everyone was like, this is dodgy, what are we going to do? But also to the Hoover brothers, who are big funded the Conservative Party in this country, for some weird reason buy lots of property in Newcastle. And we have the football fans group who are part of the campaign who collect for the food bank at match day. And Jamie Rubin tweeted out one day, I will match fund, because we're trying to get on side with people in the city who are a bit cautious about the buying the football club. I will match fund anything collected on match day from my own pocket and donate to the food bank. So we were straight on that and said, how dare you donate to the food bank when you're opposing the poverty that means people are going to the food bank. And he was like, oh, so sorry, I'd love to meet you and talk about that. So Newcastle Football Club is now a living wage employer, which meant a pay rise for 800 staff, programme sellers, people working in the bar, people working in the shops, and so on. So we've come a very long way from 30 to, we did get the council, we did get the university, we did get the football club. Last week we got the Mayor's office, Kim McGuinness has accredited the Mayor's office, Go North East, which is one of our big public transport providers, and there's a real momentum building. And our living wage week event, we've got all of the employers to commit to say, let's all work together to make the North East a living wage region. And imagine what would happen if we do that to those 70% of children in poverty working households. We could really transform that figure around and really do something. It all just came from a meeting in a church saying, how do we spend more time with our loved ones? I'll brush through this. This is some work we do nationally with government and stuff. So I wanted to leave you with a bit of like, what can I do, Sarah? This is all fair and well, but just some ideas about what you can do even here today when we think about the horrendous poverty figures that we're faced with. What do we do? Can we do anything? And I, of course, would say yes, we can. There is a huge amount we can do. And I think, like I say, the real minimum wage isn't the panacea to this, but it is a massive part of it. It's something that I know we can do something about because I've done it myself. So I would think about who you could ask to become a real minimum wage employer. It just starts with that simple ask. And then not to be put off when they say no, because that's the standard response. But who could you work with where you are to assemble a little team from people in your church, people in your community that would want to do something about this? It might be people who are running food banks and things who are like, I want to do more than just put a sticker plaster on. What low-paid staff can you work with? We've got some ambitious targets this year. Greg's is one of them, Phoenix is the other. So it just starts with us going, let's go to Greg's and have a bit of a chat with the people that are serving us. And you'll be amazed at how willing people are to talk to you and begin gathering those stories of, is this an issue? Yeah, what's it about? What's it like? Another crucial step you can take, and I think we could, like, this is where the conversation about doing it with the diocese came from, because Father Chris is outraged that only 7 Catholic dioceses are real minimum wage employers, only 5 in England. He has given you the list. Paisley in Scotland, Diocese of Cardiff and, what's it, yeah, in Wales, Hexham, Newcastle, Birmingham, Westminster, Brentford and Salford. If your diocese, I didn't say in that list, it is not a minimum wage employer. It is a payer of poverty pay. So the first thing is to ask, and then people might get confused and go, yeah, we paid. And say, well, if you pay, why are you not accredited? And I suspect it's because they are confusing the minimum wage with the living wage, because the government did steal it, which I do take as a badge of honour, because they did call the minimum wage the national living wage, which isn't a living wage, it's the minimum wage. So make sure they're not confusing that. And if they're not accredited, it might also be because of contracted parties. But if there are 7 doing it, they could speak to them. I'm sure Hexham Newcastle would be more than up for a conversation about what they did with their contracts and how they did it. The other thing is to get them to calculate it. With Newcastle City Council, they said you can't become a living wage employer because it's going to cost 500 million, a ridiculous amount of money. And I was like, I'm not a mathematician, but like, let me just work out, like, does that mean you're employing 50 million staff? Because I can't work out how it would cost that much. So often people think it's going to be more expensive than it is. And the first step to get them to do it is often to say, please could you come back with a figure of what it would cost you to actually become a living wage employer? Because then they begin to realise that it might be more doable than they first thought. And then also encouraging people to speak to the Living Wage Foundation, who are experts at helping employers work out how to do this. So they're all things that all of us could do. Think about, keep sharing stories of what's working and what isn't, because we can learn from one another. But also, like, who can support you? Is there a citizens chapter where you are that could help you with the campaign and bring other organisations along too? Father Chris sent me this. Like, I always tell people that I spend, this was laughing at me on the train, saying I know more about the Catholic Church than a lot of Catholics, because I spend a lot of time with the Catholic community. But I am not a Catholic. I was not brought up with the faith. And Father Chris is always really good at linking his back to Catholic social teaching. I'm not even going to try and do that because it would be embarrassing and you'd be like, she doesn't know what she's talking about. But Father Chris sent me this when I was coming here today, and he told me that today or tomorrow is the Church's Day of Prayer for the Poor, is that right? Yeah. And that this, he did send me this, and I did read the whole thing. He sent me this to say the letter from Pope Francis this weekend has this quote, and I won't read it again, but I need you to read, reminding us of how central this is to Catholics and how this is putting into practice the teachings into our community. This is hopefully a very practical, straightforward way that all of us can go and do this tomorrow on the church's day to pray for the poor. And then I've got some questions that I'll leave up here before we go back to the tables that might, talk about whatever you want to talk about, but things that might get us going. I think there's an important conversation about the changing face of poverty and what poverty looks like now and what's driving it. I've tried to give you some figures that highlight that. Now as a kid it was if you were unemployed, you were roving. Now it's very much inward poverty. But what does it look like where you are in the world? I'm coming from a very much northeast perspective. What's it like in your parish? And what can we do about it? If you might want to do something around minimum wage or get your diocese to become a minimum wage employer, but it might be something else. I know at conference that Anne talked about, there was a lot of discussion about the two-child limit. And the JRF data certainly supports that there's a very high correlation in terms of the numbers of people in poverty and those that will be impacted by that policy. But what actual practical steps will we take? Because I think the worst thing is that if you become overwhelmed by it and think, I don't know where to start, it's too massive. But what are the practical steps? Who can you speak to? Which employer would have the biggest impact in your local area that you want to target in terms of how many people you employ and so on? But not a really difficult one that would take years and years to get over the line. There's a lot of employers who trade on their ethical business that should be quite an easy way to get the ball rolling in the mental building. But also none of us can do this on our own. You have to do it with other people. So who else can you do it with around you? What are the organisations and institutions and people in your church that you think would have a real appetite for this? When will you speak to them about it? And when will you get coffee in with them? And who will you call on for advice and support? More than happy to leave my contact details if anyone wants that, or you could do a training session with the Living Wage Foundation on the mechanisms of accreditation. But then at the end, just who will you write to and ask? Because that's where it all starts, with asking them, do you pay a living wage? Would you be interested in meeting to discuss paying a living wage? And I think I'll leave it there.